I am going to give you kind of an inside look on how I create a sculpture and how that sculpture goes from clay or wax to bronze. There are really 3 stages that I go through to create a sculpture. They're concept, where I think of the ideas, and the book does a really great job of highlighting some of my writings and showing some insight into some of the pieces. The next stage is the creation, what I'm doing right now, taking a concept and making a piece and making all the decisions based on that concept. And then the third is casting, which I will go over with another piece after this. Concept is the most important part of my work. I think that without concept, that my work would be hollow and I really wouldn't feel like I was making any contribution. It's the driving force, and it helps me decide how things are positioned, how bodies are aligned, how they're talking to one another, and what I decide to include in a sculpture and what I decide to leave out. In the art world, there's conceptual art way over here, and some of you may be familiar with it. It's all about the idea, and you walk into a gallery and you see something you're not quite sure what, and you read about it and you see that the piece of art is the idea. That's the piece of art. And then on this side is purely figurative art, where someone is a master at making the torso and the face and the everything. And it's more of a beautiful object. I like to bring the two together. So I start with the concept, and I use the body as my medium to try to convey the concept, so that it's almost conceptual art with the body as the speaker of like what it's trying to say. So I'm recreating a piece right now that I've done before, and the piece is called Grief in the Gardener. So the first phase of my journey through creating a sculpture is the conceptual stage. And concepts are really hard to come by. You don't just sit down and say, okay, I'm going to create something and it's going to be gorgeous and it's going to be meaningful. It just doesn't work that way. Concepts are elusive, and they tend to happen in the strangest of places. So earlier this year, I was working in my orchard for hours a day, and I was kind of trying to get away from my studio, kind of just trying to breathe, to try to not beat myself up for not thinking of the greatest ideas. And so I was planting a garden and reading my favorite organic gardening book written by someone, her name is Pat Welsh. And I love this book. She's such a great writer that she makes reading about tomatoes interesting. So I was reading about tomatoes, and then I went to her blog, and this guy wrote in, and it was about a composting question, because I was, doing research. So he's writing about this compost question, and she replies with this long, eloquent reply. And he wrote back, he said, "Oh my gosh, Pat, thank you, you're great. Will you marry me? Ha ha ha." And so she says, "Oh, ha ha, thank you. It's funny you should mention that, because I'm just starting to work on my book called Grief in the Gardener. And it's about my husband, who was Frank Lloyd Wright's grandson. And he died 15 years ago, and I'm just now getting over my grief enough to be able to write about the experience. He was a judge in San Diego, and they had a long, illustrious life, and she was famous, and in her time it was very odd for a woman to kind of be the star of the show in a marriage. So anyway, she was writing about this, but her reply to this composting question was so vulnerable and so interesting that she had taken something that was talking about death and life of soil and the death of organisms and how it feeds soil. And she kind of correlated it with how her husband's memories course through her body and they nourish her soul. So he's still living within her, and he's doing it through the memories of him. And so I'm reading this book, trying to get away from art, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I have to make a sculpture. So I went over to my studio and I started this piece. And so that was the concept. You know, the concepts come in many different ways. I do a lot of writing, I do a lot of reading, I'm interested in all kinds of things like quantum physics and psychology and, a vast amount of things. And a lot of times a concept is really slow in coming, and I kind of suss out an idea and a theme starts emerging. But this one is just like, bam, I have to get to my studio and start creating this. So I went over to the table, and then now we're into the second phase, the creation. So there was concept, now's the creation. I thought, how am I going to get across this concept of grief, but how grief can be beautiful, and it can be nourishing. And someone can, by going through this, can realize that they appreciate what they had and that that person continues to live. So I didn't want the figure to seem weak because I didn't feel like it was that kind of thing. This person that I had not yet known, we've since become friends, but she seemed so strong and so sure of herself. So this is when I start making decisions about bodies, how many bodies I'm going to include in a piece, what those bodies will look like, whether they'll be tall and fragile, or whether they will be like this one, just a torso, a long elongated torso, but a torso nevertheless, because I didn't want the arms and the legs to create flimsiness almost. I wanted it to feel solid and grounded. And so I started there with the torso. And then once I get to a certain point in the sculpture where I have the basic things, kind of like I am here, a little messy, but you get the idea. Now I have a head and a body. Sometimes I have arms, not in this case though. But I want to show you how my sculptures kind of tell me what they need to be. Okay, so this sculpture is about grief, but it's also about strength. So she can be really grief-stricken. And I can make the figure, go over like that, or she can be really strong and in your face. She can be looking right at you. So just the slightest movements, body language is so interesting. It will betray a thought every time. If somebody's feeling a particular way, they can say they're happy or whatever, but you can tell whether they're guarded, whether they're, I'm listening to you, but really not, or, disinterested, whatever. Body language is just so it conveys everything. And so I love body language. I think that it's magical. So my decisions with her was that I wanted her to be a little inward feeling. So I'm curving her shoulders in just a bit. Not a lot. She's not super insecure or anything, but just enough to feel the vulnerability. And then I want her kind of staring in the middle distance because she's not confrontational. She's not looking at you saying, I'm grief-stricken. She's kind of thinking about her husband. She's feeling him. She's letting him tell her that it's okay and that things will be okay and that she's strong and she can make it through. So I get to this point in the sculpture, and I've said pretty much all I can with just body language because I've chosen to not have arms and legs and just to do the torso. When I have arms and legs, I have much more latitude. Like for instance, this piece, Through the Shadows. This is a piece about two people who are in separate places at the moment, but they happen to be so entwined. It's almost like quantum physics and theory of non-locality. And quantum entanglement and all this stuff where things can be separated over vast distances, but they still feel one another acutely, and they still move with one another. So that's kind of the basis of this piece, that people can be in separate places, yet they have a connection always. So I showed that by having them look in different directions, so they're seeing different things at the time, but they're echoing one another and they're opposite. In this theory of non-locality, if a nucleus is spinning one way, the other one will be spinning the opposite direction. So they're echoing one another. Their legs are echoing one another, their bodies, so they're entangled. And this is kind of what happens in love, that you get entangled with that person. You feel them no matter where they are, whether they're right in front of you or whether they're not in your current location. And then I brought their arms together here so that they're always at one another's fingertips. So you can always feel that person. So I had a lot more to do with body language on this piece than I do on this one. So for this one, I'll bring in symbology. And for the symbology, because it's about her receiving nutrients from the soil or from the memories of her husband, I'll put roots in her so that she's almost growing out of his memory. She's still getting his wisdom. She's still hearing his voice and feeling the person, but she's also rooted to the ground. She's solid. She's not a withering flower. She's not going to just blow away in the dust. So this piece, although rough, is kind of what I did. I let some pieces go all the way through to let air come through and to kind of signify a little pain and a little intrusion there in her heart. But then the final piece, once I get done with it, and I would refine it and all that stuff, would have these roots. So she would be growing out of it, but she would also be growing back into the ground. So through that, I hoped that I conveyed everything that I was feeling about the piece. So this piece started very specifically about this story, about Pat Welsh and her husband and losing him and all that stuff. And I referenced that by using the title of her book for the title of the piece when I cast it into bronze. But what's important to me is that I strip away, even if the piece is about me, or if it's about my husband, or if it's about Pat, that someone doesn't walk up and say, oh my God, a piece about quantum entanglement, I want to leave it open enough so that someone can come up to a piece and see themselves in it. And so I strip away anything personal, anything that would convey a specific story, and I want to leave it open so that, you can walk up and you can see yourself in it. You might not even be experiencing grief. You might be a gardener and you might get enrichment from that or something. So anyway, this is sort of what the piece looked like, except it was much more refined. And then what I did, after I did it in clay and I was able to use the clay to mush it around and get it in the right position, then I painted wax all over it and I got it refined and I got these facets that I so like and the texture. And then I sent it to a foundry and it was cast into bronze. And this is the bronze. So, a lot more work goes on, but so it goes from the concept, me gardening, reading a tomato book, to the creation, me taking those concepts and informing the piece and using that as almost a blueprint for the work. Like, what do I do? How do I make this decision? Why isn't her head turned sideways? Why isn't it, those are all because of the reasons behind the piece, the concept. Then the creation of the piece, deciding about figures and limbs and all that stuff, and then the casting. So now we're going to talk about how I take a piece from my studio that's completely finished and it gets cast into bronze. So I don't know if any of you saw the piece out in front of the gallery. It's of 5 sisters, and it's called Family Group. It's out there. But I happened to document this as I made it. So I took photos of me making the piece. So I'm going to go over very fast the creation and concept of this one and get to the casting. So at first, there's me in my studio, and I'm kind of just building the piece. And this concept was of a family group and of how people in a family, they're kind of moving in and out. They're all connected because a family, when something happens to one person, it happens to them all. And everyone feels the vibrations through the family and the repercussions. So I happen to have 4 older sisters, and I used their personalities as kind of a reference because what I wanted to do was convey different personalities in one family. So that helped me position the pieces so that they were all connected, but that each one had a different position and a different feel. So they all have different personalities. In here I'm doing directly in wax and not in clay, so I use these hot tools with a little iron and creates the drips and all that stuff. So you can see how as the piece develops, it gets more and more refined, and their head positions will kind of convey what their personalities are, whether someone's moving forward and someone's pulling back, and then the middle person's kind of holding everyone together, then one's more removed, and one is completely disinterested, so her head's off to the side. So, that kind of does a good job in sort of describing a family. Like they're not all alike. Everyone affects everyone else. This is part of the process that every artist goes through, where you get to a certain point and you go, oh, this is just not working. So this is me cutting apart the piece to reposition things so that they work. So I create the piece. You can see all the wax, all the heads are now in order. Here's the middle person all holding everyone together. This one is forward, this one is back. This one's more removed because there's a lot of space in between there. So there's me signing the piece. And a lot of times people say, wow, because this took a couple months. And they say, wow, you must feel so great after finishing a piece. How do you feel? I feel like this. So this is the final stage of me. There you go. So there's the little comic relief. So there's the final piece in wax. I took these on my patio just to kind of document the piece. So you can see the drips of the wax and how I leave the texture of kind of what I did. I don't try to make up texture. I just sort of leave it so you can see like where I smoothed out something and it dripped. Just kind of to be authentic and genuine. And there's from above, so you can see people going in and out. So now I have this big wax piece. Now what do I do with it? I need to get it into bronze. So I crate it up and I take it to the foundry. At the foundry, now we start the casting process. So let's say this is one of the heads from the family group. So this is the original, made out of clay and wax. You can kind of see it all in there. And I send this to the foundry. They paint rubber all over the thing so that it captures every little drip and every little fingerprint and every little tiny element of the piece. And the rubber, this is a little bit different than what you'll see here, but it looks like this. So you can see half the head, and it's created a big void in here. So here, they've built up layers and layers on family group. This is the rubber. And then they have to have a hard shell on the outside to keep everything together and to keep the position in the right place. So that's what they're doing here. And each one of these is a different mold. So they're creating probably 20 different molds for family group. Then what they do is they take this mold and they put it together with the other side, which some of you can't see, but it's down there. So they put it together and they pour wax into it, and they slush it around. They pour more wax, and they slush it around, and they end up with this. And then the original gets discarded. We don't keep the originals. And now you've got kind of like a hollow chocolate bunny. So it's not solid, because if they cast bronze solid, it would weigh so much that you just wouldn't be able to move it. So they have all these little waxes, and as you can see here, in here family group is in green wax. And they attach them to a little cup so that they can pour the bronze in. You'll see this later. And then they dip it. What they need to do is they need to take this hollow wax, and they need to make this into bronze. So how they do that is they dip the wax into this vat of ceramic solution, and then they roll that in sand, just like they're doing here. And they cover it up, and they create a shell around the wax. And this is the shell. So here you can see the head with the little pour cup that we saw in the picture. And this is this hard shell around the wax. The wax is still in there. You can still see the wax. So now you have a hollow wax in here with shell all around, and this shell can withstand the heat of the bronze. So what they need to do is they need to get this wax out of here and create the void in here. So they put it in an oven, and they melt all this wax out. So this is the lost wax. This is the wax that is lost when you hear lost wax casting process. So all this wax melts out, and then the things are empty inside. You can see here that there's no wax in there anymore. They take this piece and they put it upside down in a vat of sand. And here you can see all the pieces of family group sitting upside down in the vat of sand. They're empty. They've got a void in there. And then they heat up the bronze, and they bring it over and they pour it in to this thing. So here you can see them all pouring all the pieces. Then, once the bronze is in here, it cools pretty quickly, like in a half an hour or so. They take a hammer and they crack this shell open. The shell falls apart, and what you end up with is this, the bronze. All the little pieces of the bronze in bronze. Even these little connectors and the pour cup. So remember it went in here and it has little alleys where it can get to all the places. So now what they need to do is they need to cut this off and get the head separated and attach the whole family group together again. So they have 20 pieces. Here are the different pieces. Here's a torso and legs and arms and a head. And they piece each figure together one by one. They do that by welding them together. Then they weld the 5 pieces together to create the piece. And wherever they've welded it together, they have to go in and make the texture just the way I had it. So I go to the foundry and I make sure that they're doing all this correctly. And then there's the finished piece, all in bronze. So now it needs color. You notice that none of my pieces in here look like that. It's because bronze will naturally patinate itself. It will naturally age and get a color to it. In fact, this one was once shiny like the picture that you see there. So it'll do this naturally, but what I want to do is speed up that process and maybe give it a little green, a little silver, whatever colors I want to give it. So what they do is they heat up the bronze and then they start applying chemicals. So they know which chemicals to apply to make it a certain color. I stand there and I tell them yes or no, or right or wrong. And you can see them kind of applying all the color. They have to keep the whole piece hot. It takes about 3 or 4 torches. And see here you can see the green going on. So the brown went on first, then the green. And there it's all green. And then they put a wax over that. Once I think that it's going to be right, you kind of have to guess what's going to happen to this green when you put that wax on it. And then there's the finished piece.